I wanted to thank everyone who was part of putting this event together. In particular, I wanted to thank the Plowshares Fund and Prospect Hill Foundation for sponsoring and supporting the event. And also, I wanted to thank the amazing staff at Win Without War and the Arms Control Association for all their work. Folks, if you are part of those staffs, can I get you to raise your hands, please? And can I ask folks to give them a round of applause? In particular, the core teams, Sophia, Samifa, Shizuka, and Libby. Thank you all so much for all of your hard work. Thank you to our videographer, Brendan, who is doing phenomenal work, and the crew at C-SPAN for being here, and everyone at the venue staff. And before that, I also wanted to say a special word of thanks to David Courtwright, who is on my board and has been such a phenomenal figure and mentor to so many of us. And I wanted to give you a special acknowledgement today. And as well, yes. And I also wanted to say a huge thank you to Daryl as my co-conspirator in this event, who has been it is just, you are one of the fiercest advocates we have, and I'm always so glad that you are on our side. And with that, again, I know I run Win Without War, and I think that there's a lot I know about these issues, and listening to the stories of the first panel, I was blown away by how much I learned and how much there is still to discover on this and the harms. And thank you again so much for all that you all shared. And if anyone else was like me, who has that campaigner instincts, who gets really angry when you hear about those injustices, we will have action coming up that will be here in panel 3. So I will just say it will be here. And with that, I'm going to introduce Ambassador Bonnie Jenkins, who is going to be moderating our second panel. She was the former Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security. And also, I wanted to give a very personal thank you to the ambassador. There aren't that many senior women of color in this space. And you were one of the original founders of WCAPS and have been such a role model for so many women and people of color in this space. And as you have gone up through the ladders of your career, you have always made a point of ensuring that others can follow in your footsteps and have made so much room for so many of us. And I know that people like me and people like so many others would not have been in this space had it not been for the leadership that you have done. So thank you.
Wow, thanks for that introduction. Really appreciate that. Also want to thank Armed Control Association and Women Without War and all the other organizations that help make this possible. It's always great to see friends, some who I haven't seen in a while, and who are still working so hard on these issues throughout so many years. So it's good to see both those of us who are seasoned in these fields and those who are new in these fields are going to keep carrying the torch forward. So today in this panel, we're going to be looking at the role of citizens in reducing nuclear danger. And so it's an opportunity to really focus on and discuss, historically what individuals like yourselves and organizations have done to promote nuclear nonproliferation, disarmament, dealing with nuclear danger issues. There's a rich history of this. All of you who are here are personifying that because of what you do and what you do both at your work, whatever that work may be, whether it's an NGO or think tank or even, outside the U.S. working on these issues. But, also what you do individually, whether you're writing something or organizing something yourself, but, in many ways, citizens and individuals play a role in trying to promote these important issues, to promote issues that will prevent nuclear dangers. So I look forward to a panel where we can have these conversations. And, when we look at the history of what citizens have done, we heard a little bit this morning about the scientists and their role in, in developing the first nuclear weapon. We also know that there are scientists, of course, being more concerned about nuclear weapons once the bomb was detonated. And even at an early stage of atomic research, it became clear that technology was advancing very quickly. The U.S. attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki really started a strong public anti-nuclear movement. A movement of scientists developed to try to prevent military control of atomic energy, resulting in the foundation of the Federation of American Scientists. Critics of nuclear power were becoming increasingly vocal, expressing concerns about the testing of nuclear weapons in the atmosphere, radioactive fallout, and the potential for radiation to cause genetic mutations. The First World Conference Against Atomic and Hydrogen Bombs was held in Hiroshima in 1955. The Cold War resulted in more fear of nuclear attack, the construction of backyard nuclear bomb shelters, regular duck and cover drills in grade school, the ban the bomb movement in Britain, construction of missile bases were protested. Increasingly, controversy developed over construction of commercial nuclear power plants. Although the anti-nuclear movement continued in the U.S. in the 1960s and 70s, some momentum was lost as many other social issues came to the forefront, such as the Vietnam War, the women's movement, and civil rights, and environmental issues. One environmental issue strongly affected the anti-nuclear movement was a concern about thermal pollution due to hot water discharge from nuclear power facilities cooling systems. The anti-nuclear movement reemerged as a major social movement after the energy crisis in the early 1970s. This crisis and associated efforts to both expand nuclear power and provide improved nuclear safety brought many nuclear issues and concerns to the forefront. During that time, commercial nuclear power continued to develop across the globe, as did both public concerns about nuclear power and awareness of the benefits of nuclear power. The anti-nuclear movement was strongly supported by American activists Ralph Nader, the Sierra Club, and Friends of the Earth, who all called for moratoria on nuclear power development. Anti-nuclear activities were brought to worldwide attention in 1979 when the 3 Mile Island accident occurred at a nuclear power plant in Pennsylvania. In the late 1970s, also saw expansion of anti-nuclear activities in Western Europe as protests increased against the North Atlantic Treaty Organization's sharing of nuclear weapons and its stance that conventional deterrence is not nearly as effective as nuclear deterrence. That conventional deterrence is not nearly as effective as nuclear deterrence. In the 1980s, anti-nuclear activism was then largely directed to halting testing, deployment, and development of nuclear weapons, managing radioactive waste disposal, and preparing emergency evacuation plans in the event of an accident at a nuclear power plant. In June 1982, 1 million people demonstrated in New York City's Central Park against nuclear weapons and for an end to the Cold War arms race. It was the largest anti-nuclear protest and the largest political demonstration in American history, up until recently. International Day of Nuclear Disarmament protests were held on June 1983 in 50 states across the U.S. There were many Nevada Desert Experience protests and peace camps at the Nevada test site during the 80s and 90s. This movement influenced arms control agreements between Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan and positively contributed to nuclear disarmament and avoidance of nuclear war. A resurgence of nuclear interest in the anti-nuclear movement began in the mid-1980s again, after higher than normal numbers of deaths from children with leukemia was reported for residents near several types of nuclear facilities. In '86, the nuclear movement was again receiving a boost from the nuclear power plant accident in Chernobyl. And of course, I'm not going to go through the rest because we don't have time, but just this kind of sets the stage. So with the concerns of global warming and the new power plants that are being promoted, there's obviously interest continuing and into the future on nuclear issues and nuclear dangers. And that's where all of you are doing your work and stepping in to continue this legacy of work by individuals and citizens that grew up from the first test of nuclear weapons. So with that, I'm happy to note that we have 4 amazing people who will be on our panel. One person who unfortunately cannot be with us because he's in Japan. But the first person will be see on video, Akira Kawasaki, Executive Committee member from Peace Boat. Second, Susan Gordon, an old friend I haven't seen in a while. Coordinator, Multicultural Alliance for a Safe Environmental Environment, former director of the Alliance for Nuclear Accountability. Michi Takeuchi, filmmaker and second generation Habakusha. And Togzen Casanova, another good friend, Senior Fellow, Project for International Security, Commerce, and Economic Statecraft, University of Albany, and author of Atomic Step, How Kazakhstan Gave Up the Bomb. So we're going to start with a video from Kira Kawasaki.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. Let me briefly talk about the experiences of Japan with a focus on the role of Hibakusha, the atomic bomb survivors. Last year, Nihon Hidankyo was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Nihon Hidankyo stands for the Japan Confederation of the Atomic and Hydrogen Bomb Sufferers Organizations. It was created in 1956, 11 years after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and 2 years after the US major hydrogen bomb test called Castle Bravo in the Marshall Islands. Around that sea area, thousands of fishing boats were sailing, one of which was Japanese tuna fishing boat named Daigo Fukuryu Maru, or the Fifth Lucky Dragon. The crew members were exposed to the radioactive fallout without knowing what it was. After returning to a Japanese port, some of the crew members died of radioactive sickness. It triggered a huge reaction in the Japanese public. 9 years after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, for the third time, Japanese people were victimized by nuclear weapons. And it was in the context of the nuclear arms race. Countries were competing to acquire and increase nuclear weapons by conducting nuclear test explosions. This is unacceptable. Women and men in Tokyo started a petition campaign against A&H, atomic and hydrogen bombs. And the campaign was spread around Japan. The first world conference against A&H bombs was organized in Hiroshima in 1955. And in the next year, Nihon Hidankyo was established. Nihon Hidankyo, in its founding, declared to save humanity while saving themselves. It has called on the governments of the world to abolish nuclear weapons to ensure that there will be no more Hibakusha. At the same time, it has called on the Japanese government to compensate for the damage and the sufferings from the atomic bombings. It should be noted that they have called for compensation by the Japanese government on the basis of its own war responsibility. But the government's assistance measures of Hibakusha so far have been insufficient and far from such state compensation in nature. The government is providing some medical assistance to those who survived on the basis of their estimated exposure to radiation. But no compensation has been made for the hundreds of thousands of deaths. Also, the recognition of Hibakusha has been very narrowly defined. It was only in 2021 that those who were in the wide range of areas that radioactive black rain fell after the Hiroshima bomb became eligible to get recognized as Hibakusha. Also, many of atomic bomb-related diseases, such as cancer and leukemia, have been dismissed, saying that the causal relationship with the A-bomb cannot be scientifically proven. Even today, 80 years after the bombing, the Hibakusha and the Japanese government are fighting over the recognition and the support measures. The Norwegian Nobel Committee stated in its explanation about the reason to award Nihon Hidankyo that their witness testimony has greatly helped establish the nuclear taboo, or the norm against the use of nuclear weapons. In a press conference following the Nobel announcement, Ms. Masako Wada, Assistant Secretary General of Nihon Hidankyo, said that it was not nuclear weapons, but the Hibakusha's testimony that have prevented nuclear weapons from being used in war ever since Nagasaki. This is such a clear critique against nuclear deterrence. Indeed, Hibakusha's testimony has played a vital role in establishing the notion that nuclear weapons are bad. In Japan, Hibakusha's efforts have been combined with peace education at schools in keeping the public opposition to nuclear weapons high. Japan's 1967 non-nuclear three principles have been widely supported even today. Internationally, the Hibakusha, including Nihon Hidankyo representatives, have repeatedly attended and spoken at the NPT review conferences and preparatory committee meetings, warning the world's governments of the danger of nuclear weapons. Also, they played a central role in a humanitarian initiative that led to the adoption of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, TPNW, in 2017. Hibakusha's testimonies is so powerful and direct in convincing governments of the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. Many NGOs, including Mayors for Peace and my organization, Peaceboat, have partnered with Hibakusha in spreading their messages and encouraging the governments to advance nuclear disarmament, including through the universalization of the TPNW. The Nobel Peace Prize is not only a recognition of its achievement, but also an encouragement of further work. In ICANN's case, thanks to the 2017 award, it could expand the staff team and partner organizations both. But in the case of Nihon Hidankyo, the same model cannot apply. Hibakusha's average age is 86. Today, the number of Hibakusha who are alive is a little less than 100,000 every year. Nearly 10,000 are dying. This leads to the question of how we can collectively pass down the memories of Hibakusha so the norm against nuclear weapons is kept strong, a question that I hope to be lively discussed later in the panel. Thank you very much.
So it'd be great if our panelists can join me up here. And also, if you have questions, please remember to put those on your index cards and just raise your hand when you have one, and someone will gather from you. So our first panelist is Susan Gordon. And please refer to your handouts because all the bios are attached.
So thank you. Is this on now? Yes. Okay, good. So you probably don't remember, but I was with you the day that Hillary Clinton made you an ambassador. So it was quite a stunning moment. We had to leave all our cell phones and lock them up and stuff, but I'm so honored to have seen that and still have you doing this work. So I particularly appreciated the timeline that you were lining out because it does impact what was going on in the US. So I'm going to repeat that in 1982, nearly 1 million people showed up in New York City for the largest ever No Nukes rally. There was broad public support for an international framework to freeze nuclear weapons production. So this is my story, but it illustrates the power of grassroots community organizing and the successes that we can collectively claim. In 1984, I was living on the Oregon coast. I had started to get involved in the local anti-nuclear movement and helped to pass a county ballot measure to make Coos County a nuclear weapons-free zone. This same local-based political action was being replicated across the U.S. with more than 220 zones created. Grassroots leaders in Oregon united 25 groups, and we founded Oregon Peaceworks in 1987, which became the leading peace and environmental organization in the state. We formed a political arm as well so that we could work on electoral campaigns. Internally, we decided that we needed to replace the representative in the 2nd Congressional District in order to move our agenda forward. So we organized and co-led the campaign for Representative Mike Kopetsky. He was in the Oregon House, but lost in 1988 by 707 votes. We kept campaign staff in place and continued to organize and won the 1990 election. Shortly after Mike was elected to office, I reached out to the DC-based arms control groups and asked what we in Oregon could do to help stop nuclear weapons production. I was promptly turned away because our new representative was a freshman in Congress, would have no power since Oregon was a powerless state, and no one would want to work with us. And I might add that I was a woman. I pushed back 3 times and was eventually given a challenge that no one expected we could meet. But our campaign work with Representative Kopetsky had made him a supporter, and he quickly agreed to start the discussion for a test moratorium. Within 1 week, Mike and House Majority Leader Dick Gephardt were able to get a letter and draft legislation to their fellow members of Congress, and that became the basis of our next 3 years of work. In addition to Mike, Oregon Republican Senator Mark Hatfield was a key leader for the test moratorium. Senator Hatfield was on the first Navy ship that sailed into Hiroshima Harbor after the bomb dropped. He often spoke about his experience witnessing the devastation, and each year voted against the U.S. military budget. It was quite remarkable because all the votes were 99-1. And he kept voting year after year. Our local grassroots groups met monthly and received information from the national organizations about what was needed. I reached out to Mike, and he did the behind-the-scenes work to move legislation forward in D.C. On October 6, 1992, President George H.W. Bush signed into law the Hatfield-Exxon-Mitchell Amendment, establishing a temporary unilateral moratorium on nuclear testing. That moratorium has held and still works to constrain the U.S. and other countries from full-scale nuclear weapons testing. I believe that this is a prime example of how a small group of people can change the world, to paraphrase Margaret Mead. My personal next step was accepting a position as the executive director of the Alliance for Nuclear Accountability, ANA, based in Seattle. ANA was also founded in 1987 when grassroots groups living in the shadows of the nuclear weapons complex production sites came together to share experiences and build power to hold the Department of Energy, DOE, accountable for policies that had left contamination and illnesses in our communities. I joined ANA in 1995 and stayed for 17 years. ANA is led by grassroots organizations, and in June of this year, they held their 36th annual DC Days to bring local folks to Washington to speak to members of Congress and key agencies to press for policies to protect our communities. And I have to say, many years we held that in this room, so it was very spooky walking in. The ANA network expanded by building trust among the groups, sharing information and tactics. In 1995, you needed a dial-up modem to access the internet. Most of the ANA groups did not have that ability, so we relied on fax machines. If a local group was meeting with DOE official at the Fernald Feed Plant near Cincinnati, Ohio, and were told some information, we could quickly fax it to the next group near the Mound Plant in Dayton, Ohio, to ask the same questions. We began to force them to tell the truth about environmental contamination. ANA was committed to empowering grassroots communities by providing funding to buy fax machines and modems and for travel to participate in national meetings. That model of support for participation is a hallmark of how to organize democratically. We had staff in DC and in our Seattle office that coordinated, fundraised, and helped to build strategies that did not allow for NIMBYism, not in my backyard, as an acceptable position. Any DOE decision that negatively impacted one of our groups was opposed by all of the groups. We forced them to stop the shell game of moving waste between communities as an alleged cleanup plan. We had to learn to become citizen experts on our DOE sites. We taught ourselves how to read the federal budget, and in particular, the budgets at each production site in the complex. We could track specific weapons programs and were able to see and document how much money was actually being spent on nuclear weapons production and how little was being spent on cleanup of the environmental legacy. Clean up, don't build up was our motto. That holds true to this day. In the past 10 years, the nuclear weapons budget has increased by $9.5 billion in 2025 dollars. At the same time, the environmental management budget stagnated. The cleanup budget has only increased by $1.3 billion in 10 years. Arjun Makajani taught us about science and the impacts of radiation on our health, and as a result, we were able to demand more protective cleanups at closure sites. We won a lawsuit against DOE and used the settlement to create a $3 million fund that provided grants to grassroots groups that were then able to hire their own experts to counter the disinformation from DOE. One of our fund resistance actions came about when DOE announced Complex 21, a proposal to rebuild the entire weapons production complex. ANA dubbed it as Bombplex 21, and we organized with many national and local groups to send in email comments to DOE. This was the first time that electronic mail was used in such a manner, and we generated over 150,000 comments opposing this misguided plan. The Cold War ended in 1991, which created an opening to talk about ending nuclear weapons production worldwide, and ANA saw some significant environmental wins. The main plutonium processing facility at Rocky Flats in Colorado was shut down during an FBI raid after environmental and health concerns were raised by the local Rocky Mountain Peace and Justice Group. The Fernald feed plant misled the community into thinking it was a Purina animal-free feed plant, but was actually processing uranium. The local group sued the DOE for contaminating their community and won. Congress immediately passed a bill to prevent future lawsuits against the Department of Energy. ANA worked with Senator John Glenn to force the National Institutes of Health to release a study about the potential health risks from the fallout from the above-ground nuclear weapons tests in the U.S. The report had been suppressed for 14 years. You can now go online and type in your date of birth, your location during the testing, and your milk consumption, and receive information about your potential radiation exposures. There are many other stories about our collective work. We partnered with Russian anti-nuclear activists and joined in several exchange visits, sharing skills and building strategies. Kazakh activists working on closing the Russian test site traveled to the Nevada test site and founded the Nevada Semi-International Movement to close all nuclear weapons tests. After leaving ANA, I joined the Multicultural Alliance for a Safe Environment, working on uranium mining issues with indigenous communities in New Mexico, and that's where I am today. Uranium is the first step in the nuclear fuel chain, and the environmental legacy has still not been addressed. We are now facing a renewed interest in uranium mining due to the administration's push to fast-track energy production. I have come full circle, starting with grassroots community organizing in Oregon, moving into state, national, and international work, and now returning to grassroots organizing in New Mexico. It is our persistence despite the challenges that has moved this work along, and a good sense of humor too. We understand the dangers, and we carry the responsibility to find new leaders to continue our work. I'm grateful to have been part of this journey and proud to have been a leader along the way. Thank you for this opportunity to share my story. It is intertwined with stories from many of the people that are here today speaking, and thank you.
That was great. Thank you. Okay, so now we have Michi Takeuchi. Did you want to-
Sorry. Thank you so much, Ambassador Jenkins. It is such an honor to be here today. Excuse me. Is this a, can you hear? It is such an honor to be here today to take the part in this important 80th commemorative event hosted by the Arms Control Association and Win Without War. My name is Michi Takeuchi. I've lived in New York City for many years, but I grew up in Hiroshima. Both my grandfather and my mother survived the atomic bombing. My grandfather, Dr. Ken Takeuchi, was director of the Hiroshima Red Cross Hospital at that time. My mother, Takako Takeuchi, entered the city on August 8th, 2 days after the bombing, to search for him. She found him seriously injured and stayed at the hospital for several days to care for him, unknowingly exposing herself to radiation. Yet, growing up, my family rarely spoke about their experiences. This silence was common among Hiroshima families. As a result, I was unaware of what truly happened to Hiroshima's people and how nuclear weapons had affected my own family. That changed when I encountered a remarkable NPO called Youth Arts New York, which had created an educational program called Hibakusha Stories, designed to empower youth to help build a world free of nuclear weapons. The program brought atomic bomb survivors from Hiroshima and Nagasaki to speak directly with high school students in the 5 boroughs of New York City. Hearing their testimonies left a deep impression on students and on me too. Over the years, the program reached more than 50,000 students. It was a powerful collaboration between Hibakusha and American educators. Through Hibakusha Stories, I met Setsuko Soro, a Hibakusha from Hiroshima and a lifelong advocate for nuclear disarmament. She delivered the co-acceptance speech in the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017, which was awarded to ICANN. She came to New York from Toronto to participate in the program. We quickly became close. We were both expats living in North America, and we discovered that we had attended the same girls' school in Hiroshima. Setsuko was constantly traveling and sharing her testimony. Her words moved people across culture and generations. But as the demand for her presence grew, so did the physical toll. Though incredibly strong, she was in her mid-80s, and that travel and intense schedule became exhausting. I felt that the documentary could carry her voice farther, preserving her legacy and message for future generations without requiring her to be everywhere in person. That's how my film, The Vow from Hiroshima, began. The film also captured a historic moment, the creation and passage of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which entered into force in 2021. Audience responses have been deeply encouraging. We hope to continue using the film to inform and inspire people who may not know what really happened under the mushroom clouds. When we were making the film, Setsuko and other hibakusha encouraged me to explore my grandfather's history. There was not much information to be found. As I said before, he was the director of Hiroshima Red Cross Hospital then, and because all the hibakusha had dealings with the Red Cross Hospital, they were grateful for its presence in the horrific aftermath. It represented hope for all the survivors. I understand I am considered second-generation hibakusha because of my mother's experience. At first, being called this made me feel uneasy. I often hesitated to speak publicly about my family's experiences since they had not shared them with me and they were not my own. Later, I learned that many hibakusha had remained silent due to concerns about the stigma related to radiation exposure, especially its possible effects on their children's employment and marriage prospects. Then, one day, in the spring of 2023, something changed. Back in Japan, when I was emptying my parents' home after they passed away, I found my grandfather's old black notebook, his work journal from the hospital covering the period from August 15, 1945 through 1948. The pages were faint, written in pencil, and hard to read after nearly 80 years. But I sensed they held something important. His record of those challenging and unimaginable days after the bombing. I shared the notebook with NHK, the Japanese public broadcaster, knowing they could help decipher and interpret the writings. They were immediately excited by the possibilities. Thanks to their expert team of researchers and historians, they were able to analyze the notebook and build a comprehensive narrative from its pages. As a result, NHK produced a special program titled Hiroshima Red Cross Hospital, Tower of Life. It revealed what truly happened in the days and years following the atomic bombing. The program aired nationally in Japan on August 6th last year. When the bomb was dropped, the hospital was one of the only 2 medical facilities that withstood the blast. It became a visible landmark in a flattened landscape. Thousands of injured and dying people streamed to the hospital seeking help. But inside the hospital, the situation was catastrophic. Equipment was destroyed, medical supplies evaporated, and even walking over the debris was nearly impossible. Of the more than 550 doctors and nurses at the hospital, over 50 were killed instantly, and more than 250 were seriously injured. My grandfather was among them, crushed by a heavy door and pierced all over by shattered glass. Yet, despite his injuries, he led the surviving medical staff, working day and night to care for the wounded and those suffering from radiation sickness, a phenomenon no one yet understood. On August 29, 1945, Fritz Bilfinger, a delegate from the International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, visited the Hiroshima Red Cross Hospital. He immediately responded to the overwhelming scale of devastation and human suffering. My grandfather met with him, explained the hospital's dire condition, pleading for help in securing urgently needed medical supplies. Within 10 days, Dr. Marcel Junot, a senior ICRC field delegate, arrived in Hiroshima. He had negotiated with American occupation forces, and 6 US military planes accompanied him, delivering 15 tons of desperately needed medical aid. Dr. Junot later wrote that despite their own injuries, the hospital staff were working with extraordinary courage and dedication. These doctors and nurses were the first responders in human history to treat victims of a nuclear weapon used in war. With no precedent and no understanding of radiation's effects, the medical staff faced an unimaginable challenge. Junot's visit was a rare moment of international recognition and solidarity in those early weeks. Just days later, on September 5, 1945, the ICRC issued a formal statement declaring that the use of nuclear weapons must be prohibited under international law. This was not a political declaration. It was a humanitarian one grounded in the suffering the ICRC witnessed in Hiroshima. What I have learned about my grandfather through the fragile pages of his notebook has given me a new understanding of who he was and what he endured. Now, at last, I'm able to really grieve for him. Understanding my grandfather's role and the suffering he witnessed helped me to grasp the humanitarian imperative behind banning the world's nuclear arsenals. What began as a personal awakening has become a public commitment to use The Vow from Hiroshima, the film that tells Setsuko Soro's life story and the birth of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, to inform and inspire action toward a world without nuclear weapons. The world still faces the grave threat of nuclear war, but we must also carry the power and the responsibility as citizens, educators, artists, and advocates to protect future generations. Today, 80 years later, as we reflect on the lives of those who endured the unimaginable, not only the survivors, but also those who care for them, we need to recognize the impact of civil society and its ability to respond to such horror with compassion. We need to support the role of civil society, which at its best awakens empathy, opens dialogues, mobilizes action, and shapes a future free from the shadow of nuclear weapons. Thank you.
Okay, our final panelists. Thank you. That was really good. Taksan Casanova.
It was a cold February day in 1989. Yet another underground nuclear test rocked the mountain of Dagestan in eastern Kazakhstan. Nothing extraordinary. The Soviet military has been testing nuclear weapons for almost 40 years at that point. As happened on many occasions in the past, the radioactive gases escaped the damaged mountain rock and caused severe contamination. The radiation detection devices at a nearby base for Soviet heavy bombers detected high levels of radiation. But unlike in the past, this information did not stay secret. The Soviet Union under Mikhail Gorbachev was undergoing a major transition. Perestroika and glasnost were causing the first cracks in the tightly controlled Soviet system. The news of contamination reached the local regional governor in Semipalatinsk and the government of Kazakhstan in Almaty. The same information also reached a famous Kazakh writer and poet Olzhas Suleimanov, who was also a member of the Soviet parliament. Within days, Suleimanov was on Kazakh TV inviting those who cared to come to the House of Writers in Almaty to show their protest against nuclear tests. The meeting was scheduled for a couple of days later. What he didn't expect was for thousands of people to show up. In fact, the conference hall inside of the House of Writers in Almaty could only hold 400 people, and so many others had to stay outside in the freezing February cold. At that first rally, speakers, most of them from the affected region, spoke powerfully about the impact of Soviet nuclear tests on their lives and their families. A female obstetrician who helped deliver babies in one of the villages next to the testing site, she shared, "In the last 6 months, out of 48 births, 12 were tragic. 6 newborns died, and 6 were born either without limbs or with Down syndrome." That day, Kazakhstan's anti-nuclear movement was formed. Within days, millions of people signed petitions to stop nuclear tests. And I want to remind, this was 1989, Soviet Union, no social media, no internet. The message was spread throughout the Republic because the journalists who participated in the movement, they were able to use their regional networks and tell their colleagues to spread the message further. People of all backgrounds, ages, and professions joined the movement. Due to the involvement of people from creative professions, filmmakers, and writers, there was a lot of Kazakh symbolism in the rallies. There was almost, I have goosebumps as I speak. There was almost cinematic quality in how they would put these events together. During one of the rallies near the testing site, the people walked between 2 fires, signifying the act of cleansing or catharsis. They hurled rocks into a large pile to create a burial site for the evil nuclear threat. They tied pieces of white cloth on a tree, hoping that their wishes would be granted. The Kazakh anti-nuclear movement was named Nevada Semipalatinsk. And it was because from the very beginning, Kazakhs saw their fight as part of the global fight and global broader struggle. The leaders of the movement sought to establish connection with peace activists in the United States. Kazakh anti-nuclear activists, they longed to be heard and to be supported by the American peers who were waging a similar campaign here in the United States. The movement's leaders would come to the US to tell their stories and also to learn from their American peers how to organize peaceful protests and how to engage in acts of disobedience. And in one of the interviews that I did, one of the leaders of the movement, himself a very prominent culturologist, son of a very famous Kazakh writer, Murat Oezov, he shared that when in 1990, when he came to the US, one of his favorite memories was from San Francisco. where he met the activists, and he said, what wonderful people those were. They were the ones who blocked roads, got arrested. They shared their experience and brought lots of valuable literature with them. And indeed, Kazakhs were not alone in their struggle, because activists from the United States, Canada, Europe, Japan would come and participate in some of the protests happening in Kazakhstan and in peace marches. There was this huge international Congress of International Voters for the Prevention of Nuclear War held in Almaty in cooperation with International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. And 400 participants from 20 countries came: teachers, lawyers, physicians, nuclear physicists, students, hibakusha from Japan, downwinders from the US. And I want to read a quote from Dan Yan, who was at the time the president of Physicians for Social Responsibility. And he describes one of their visits to Karaul. It's a settlement near the testing site. 2,000 or 3,000 people met us and mingled with us in a large field, as dozens of their fellow villagers told the sad stories of Soviet downwinders. American downwinders and hibakusha from Japan told their stories as well. While these stories were tragic, the atmosphere was that of a great celebration. Kazakh musicians and dancers entertained us. Our host gave us a glorious feast in yurts, some 40 of which were erected for the occasion. The children, who had never seen foreigners before, circulated everywhere, asking us to sign their papers. And he noted that he saw how much courage it took, because it was still a Soviet republic, very dependent on Moscow. And that massive anti-nuclear movement in Kazakhstan took the Soviet military, almost by surprise. The protest began in February of 1989, and the Soviet military just couldn't conduct as many tests as they planned because of this massive outcry. So they continued, but they couldn't keep up at the pace they planned. And actually, by October of the same year, they did their last test. They just couldn't continue because, the public was just so strong. And so the protest continued, and Moscow tried to bargain, saying, we'll offer some social programs, we'll do a survey of health and so on. But by then, it was too late. The population was just not agreeing to, even for a short extension of the testing period. And so politically, the government of Kazakhstan at the time, they were appointed by Moscow, so not free people. But because of this massive public movement, they could use it, first a little bit timidly and then more forcefully. So by 91, they were just standing very strong in their own political struggle with Moscow and saying, that's it, you need to stop it. And so finally, on August 29th, of 91, exactly 42 years after the first Soviet nuclear test, Kazakhstan, while still being a Soviet republic, shut down the Semipalatinsk nuclear testing site, banned nuclear tests on its territory, and by a decree that was signed by then President Nazarbayev. And due to politics within Kazakhstan, there was a lot of emphasis that, the president signed the decree. And so even within Kazakhstan, we don't appreciate enough the power of the people, actually, the people who were there, walking and protesting and doing all this hard work. And I think both within Kazakhstan and internationally, we don't recognize the butterfly effect that the movement had. Thank you to Daryl, who always points this out, because a month after Kazakhstan shut down the Semipalatinsk nuclear testing site, Gorbachev announced a unilateral Soviet nuclear testing moratorium. Then in response, later that year, legislation was introduced here for a reciprocal test moratorium. Then it became a law in 92. And in July of 93, Clinton decided to extend the US test moratorium. And as we know, from 94 to 96, negotiations on the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, and then we have CTBT signed by the US as a first country to sign. And while CTBT is not in force yet, we see that the norm against nuclear tests is so strong, and the monitoring system is so well developed. And hopefully, eventually, the U.S. and others would do the right thing and ratify the CTBT. But the last thing I want to leave you with is that I think very often, especially in places like DC, we discuss nuclear policy, at high level, as our country did this, the government did that, but we don't pay enough tribute to people, Kazakhs, Americans, Japanese, those who are actually doing so much work on the ground that makes all these policy achievements possible. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Okay, so I think we have 5 minutes. That's it before Q&A? Wow, okay. So I'll just have time for one question. And please remember to, if you have questions, to put them on your slip so they'll pick them up. So one of the things I wanted to ask and get a view from our panelists is to talk a little bit more about some of the challenges that we see today. We heard about some of those from Daryl Kimball when he did some of the introductions. What are some of the challenges today that you see in terms of dealing with nuclear dangers and the role of citizens? And what are the new challenges that citizens and groups have to face now in trying to address those challenges? So I think I'll start with Susan, since you spoke first.
Thank you. I'm not technologically gifted. Well, I think that the challenge is ignorance, especially the young folks that are coming up. We need them as our leaders, but they don't understand the history of what went on before. And because for the younger folks at this point, there hasn't really been a nuclear accident so much in their lifetime, right? We have Fukushima, but it's kind of far away. And when 3 Mile Island happened in 1979, that's when the U.S. was really looking at expanding nuclear power in this country. So they really suppressed what was going on at 3 Mile Island. And then for my communities in New Mexico, on July 16th, 1979, 3 months after 3 Mile Island, there was the largest release of radioactive material in U.S. history. It still has not been cleaned up, and we do an annual commemoration on Navajo Nation about that uranium tailing spill accident. So it's education. It's, we have to keep sharing our stories, and somehow that needs to inspire, commitment to doing the work, which is really difficult.
Thank you. Richie?
Yes, thank you. That's a very difficult question. As much as I think is that, in my case, I really feel I really need to stick to the core of the stories that I like to share. I live in the United States. I'm an expat in the United States. I love this country. And yet I know where I'm from. And I don't want any conversation that I ever have in any community conversations or whatever, that I just, once people start to, okay, maybe I'm a little older than other people, but Sometimes I hear, well, the Pearl Harbor. Once the Pearl Harbor issue comes out, I'm finished. Because that's really like a waste of time for everyone. So what I'm trying to say is that it's very important for me not to overreact to anything and yet keep talking about what I need to share and open the dialogue and have a conversation without having any particular results possibly.
For me, I think the main troubling phenomenon that I'm observing is complete irresponsibility and bravado of the political establishment, be it, Russia engaging in nuclear blackmail or calls here in the United States for the resumption of nuclear testing, that I just find it so irresponsible that something so major can be talked about so frivolously. And I just find it that it's very irresponsible and not something that countries that are responsible players in the international global order should engage in. And the second component, what I find really hard for me personally, especially because of all the work I do with the affected communities in Kazakhstan or hearing all the other stories from other communities, is how detached nuclear policy conversations are in DC, Geneva, New York, or Vienna. It's just, so abstract. And you see this brilliant people discussing nuclear policy in a very abstract, almost theoretical way, almost luxuriating in, the luxury of intellectual discourse on nuclear weapons. And what I see for myself are, the children that I meet who are still paying the price for the nuclear arsenal that is now used for nuclear blackmail, for example, by a different country. And so, this disconnect between what's actually happening on the ground and the continued high price that is being paid for something that is so abstract in so many powerful, decision makers' minds.
Great, thank you. I don't have 3-4 minutes left, 5 minutes left. Well, I have one question, but just to kind of follow up on what you guys have been saying, what is the role you think of disinformation in the era of trying to prevent nuclear dangers? And you see what happened with, with the U.S. bombing of Iran, and a lot of that there's a lot of disinformation. But as we talk about education, as we talk about the younger generation and bringing more people into the field, what is the role of disinformation and all that? How does that impact it? Anyone who has a thought on that?
Yeah, it's very complicated because I think people are hearing information about whatever the issue is right now. If it comes from somebody that they believe, it doesn't matter what comes out of their mouths, they believe it. And so that makes it really challenging for us to be able to, tell the truth, counter what's being said. But already people, their ears are closed. They don't want to hear what the truth is. So it's playing a big impact on Navajo Nation. And it's very challenging to try to figure out how to, to reach through that because people have already made their minds up.
I really don't know how to respond. And this information, it's beyond my comprehension, but as far as I'm concerned, I really decided that I like to work with young people before they get polluted.
And I just want to take, put a question, and put the light, for example, on myself or on all of us. My first identity is of a scholar, and I think it's so important for all of us who work on these issues also to be intellectually honest and not exaggerate when, for example, if there is a fact or something is confirmed, and then, for example, I as a scholar can say it with conviction, or I can say that's the best, what I can tell you with the information that I possess. But at least for me, it's also very important, even for a good or noble cause, not to exaggerate or not to insert the information that might not be as correct, because in order not to lose legitimacy. So I think intellectual honesty and academic integrity are also vital for all the actors, no matter on what side you think you are.
Okay, so I do have one question, and then we'll conclude. This is for you, Tagzan. Is there any hope that people in Russia today can band together and create a movement against nuclear weapons? Is there currently such a movement in Russia? Do you know? Can they collaborate with others outside of Russia?
So first, I want to give credit to all the scientists or activists who throughout the Soviet period and the modern Russia period worked on these issues and continue working. Unfortunately, the current situation in Russia is not conducive for large-scale work on these kind of issues. And so I know these people are there, and I know it's so difficult for them now. And I believe that they're doing what they can, but unfortunately, I think in the current environment we're in, we cannot expect any large-scale movement on these issues.
Yeah, ANA did a lot of exchanges with the Russian activists working on nuclear weapons policy. We traveled there, we went to Siberia, we did all kinds of presentations, we did media training with them and brought them here to this room to join us in lobbying in here. But most of the leaders have been driven out. Natalia Mironova, who had a network of groups in Siberia, she was attacked, her apartment was broken into, materials were stolen. So she has sought asylum and has gotten her naturalization here in the U.S. What is his name? Vladimir Sliviak. He was a Russian activist. He went to South Africa and pretty much, single-handedly convinced South Africans not to move forward with nuclear power. He has had to leave and is now in Germany. Natalia, oh boy, I can't remember what her name is. Another activist. She ended up as a refugee in Paris. She is regularly on the news in Paris talking about Ukraine because she's Ukrainian. Many of them had Ukrainian background. So I just know, name after name of people that have had to leave because it is no longer safe to be in Putin's Russia.
Well, I think the sign says time expired. So first of all, I want to thank all the panelists, all four of our panelists, for what I thought was a really good discussion. I think this could go on for a while because I had a lot of questions. But just want to thank you also for all of the work that you do in this space, and to continue to have the visions that you have, the strength that you have, encouraging others to be involved. There's still work to do. So just thank you for everything you're doing on this. Really, really appreciate it. And so do the people who don't even know you're doing it. They appreciate it too.